Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. The past month has been something else, hasn't it? A European nation invaded and Canadian bank accounts frozen. World governments trying to echo every Bond villain and private companies not doing much better. Cyber attacks on everything, but citizens' uncertainty running rampant, meaning that cyber attacks are just as likely to be their own government's false flag attack rather than the efforts of an adversary. Our own military service members being egged on to fight a global war, and yet also being kicked out of the military for being an extremist or refusing an illegal order in the form of a medical procedure. School children being openly propagandized while the elites, on all sides of the political spectrum, are taking advantage of everything they can.
We mustn't panic! We mustn't panic!
So today, for those of you that are still with us, we're going to talk about a few lessons learned from just living life over the past few weeks and months. On the production side of things, we wanted to have much higher quality videos dedicated to succinct lessons learned from each world event that has occurred over the past few weeks, but we simply don't have the time and things are moving fast. So let's quickly run through some of the thoughts we've had here and observations of the problems that have gone from theoretical risks to immediately impacting daily life with the stroke of a pen. And a great way to start is with banking. Whether it's a government freezing a bank account because a person donated to a charity on GoFundMe, or if it's a private company, Visa or MasterCard, shutting down their services to an entire nation, clearly a lot of theoretical financial problems that we've seen in the past are coming to bear. And what we mean by that is that this is not a new problem. We have seen this kind of stuff before. We've seen companies like Bank of America and Citigroup trying to prevent people from buying firearms with their credit cards, or reporting gun purchases to the ATF voluntarily, without a court order, even when the transaction was perfectly legal. This was only a couple of years ago, but how quickly we forget these vulnerabilities. To be honest, by and large, the effect of this surveillance hasn't been felt too much by the average American, because most Americans have adapted to accepting that mass surveillance is a part of their daily life now. But here's the problem. We went from Bank of America and Citibank changing their policies and a few lawsuits getting slung around a couple of years ago to an entire nation's credit cards being shut off instantly. We went from what was largely a couple of case studies here and there to mass implementation instantly. We've seen this in two groundbreaking incidents in just the past 2 weeks. Canadians having their bank accounts seized or shut off due to peacefully protesting, or, here's the really crazy part, simply donating $5 or $10 to a charity. We've always thought that if there is some vulnerability that exists, world governments and companies will exploit that at some point. And with Russia, well, if Visa and MasterCard can shut down every Russian citizen's bank account or credit card, they can do it to you as well. 2 years ago, it would have been unheard of for people to have their bank accounts frozen due to crowdfunding on GoFundMe. But now we're seeing Visa and MasterCard block their transactional services in Russia. Imagine if you were a Russian citizen protesting Putin's actions, and you get home to find out that your credit card doesn't work. Never you mind that blocking the credit and debit cards, the transactional capabilities of citizens, is a war crime. Private finances of individual citizens are what we call a protected entity in the field of warfare, but don't take my word for it, just look up the Geneva Conventions. Even here in the United States, prisoners in prison have bank accounts and money that they are allowed to spend at the prison canteen. But here we are, governments seizing money from their own citizens, or citizens of another nation, for the crime of existing. Plus, even if you make the argument that Visa is an American company and Russia should have thought about that before invading, the larger point is that Visa and MasterCard blacklisting Russia single-handedly gave the green light for every single cyber attack that Russia can do on our own banking systems. Everyone for decades in the international community has been terrified beyond belief to impose even the slightest restriction on countries like Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, or even China. But here we are, a private company in the US conducting diplomacy on their own. Diplomacy that is going to result in our own institutions being a target, so way to go.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
The US makes sure that a Russian babushka can't buy bread, Putin isn't affected at all, and now Russia is in a position where attacking the US is a perfectly justifiable option. Remember, most wars are started and finished due to economic reasons. Oh, and the icing on the cake, Every Russian and hundreds of millions of people around the world are looking to the Far East for solutions. That's right, Visa and MasterCard shutting off their services to Russia and therefore forcing them to go to China for financial means is single-handedly resulting in devaluing the US dollar even more than rampant inflation already is. Another huge problem is the precedent this sets. If a government can shut off your bank account for donating money to a cause, how far away are we from getting our bank accounts frozen because we donated to a particular political party, or because of how we vote? Political party affiliation is already public record, and though Canada is much closer to finding out the answer to that question than we are, we here in the US quite literally have to think about this stuff, when even just 2 years ago this would have been outlandish to consider. In any case, this proves the vulnerability of our modern financial institutions when it comes to private banking. And another similarly related vulnerability lies within retirement accounts. Some states have invested state pensions and retirement accounts into Russian banks. This is a problem due to the government-mandated embargoes or private company virtue signaling that is going on right now that makes all things Russian forbidden. For instance, in North Carolina, the Treasury Department has disclosed that they have invested $80 million of the state retirement pension fund in Russian banks and funds. Right now, it isn't clear whether or not this is going to be divested, but the larger point is that one of the most safe forms of income, a government pension or retirement account, is no longer as safe as we thought it was. It probably never was that secure in the first place, but that's a topic for another day. The interesting thing is that when people start messing around with retirement accounts and start thinking about changing things up, that makes a lot of people really upset because retirement is one of the things that human beings really live for. Another critical vulnerability that we have talked about in the past is the energy sector. And this is where people usually nod off and don't pay attention because talking about energy is boring.
Boring!
And preparing for an energy crisis is boring too. But nevertheless, this is something that we've been warning people about for a long time. And now that the runaway train of anti-Russian hysteria is truly off the rails in pretty much all aspects of society, Europe in particular is leaving out the mistakes that have been decades in the making. Watching the energy emergency that is happening in Germany and the rest of Europe is utterly tragic and was entirely 100% preventable. But since we can't change the past, we can identify and begin to solve these problems now, at least on an individual level. The totalitarianism that ran and continues to run rampant from the thing that shall not be named proved to us that governments at any and all levels are perfectly willing to watch you suffer the consequences of an energy crisis, mostly for control reasons. Remember the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack? Yeah, the cyber attack that shut down 90% of all gas stations on the East Coast for 6 days. The crisis in which the Biden regime said it wouldn't affect you if you had an electric car? Well, check it out. That rhetoric is back because the Secretary of Transportation, the same guy who pretended to ride a bike into work, just said that line again. This honestly isn't surprising. Remember, the absolute first thing that happened when things got crazy in 2020 was the restriction of travel. And that happened under two supposedly different political parties. And in states which have, since then, apparently have forgotten all about that because their politicians, like in Texas and Florida, seem to have forgotten the fact that they restricted their own citizens' ability to travel in and out of the state. Well, now that that situation has outlived its usefulness, the dictators of the world need a new way to restrict citizens' travel. And what better way to do that than to make it so that people physically cannot afford to drive anywhere? A lot of people are calling the remarks by the Biden regime out of touch or something like that, but I don't think that's the case. Telling someone to just go buy a Tesla seems like a let them eat cake moment. But I think it's a tactic to try to harm the American people by offering a solution that does no good whatsoever and even seems insulting. Remember, when these people tell you what their plans are to your face, it's probably a good idea to take note of that.
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
And the interesting thing is that they are partially correct. If I had an electric car and enough solar panels and batteries to take it fully off-grid, that self-reliance would reduce my own vulnerabilities, at least with regards to some transportation. As is, we could store a limited amount of petroleum products like gasoline, but once that runs out, it's gone. I can't exactly sink a petroleum distillation operation in my backyard. It doesn't work like that. So taking advantage of ideas like this is great because it allows a person to use the dictatorial decrees against the dictators themselves by way of making their control over you irrelevant. one might notice a theme developing, a commonality that points to politicians taking advantage of the Ukrainian war to commit crimes against their own people, under the guise of denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's the political equivalent to protesting harsh working conditions by chaining yourself to your own desk. And right now, a lot of old political decisions from decades ago are now coming to bear, such as the 21st Amendment and the failure of many states to ratify it. These days, a lot of people are asking themselves, hey, yeah, why do we have ABC states anyway? The bigger unanswered question is, how did Prohibition get started in the first place? How did a brief, temporary societal issue get cemented in the document that is supposed to protect our rights? And can that happen again with some other issue? That, again, is a debate for another time. But like clockwork, the bottom line is that we can debate the philosophy of our founding documents and what our rights even are. But at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, a lot of citizens flip on the TV to see their governor pouring out liquor that their tax dollars already paid for. And though there are some legal implications of what's going on with regards to alcohol sales, the 2020s have proven that politicians, private companies, and enforcement agencies will break every law they possibly can to virtue signal.
Stop breaking the law!
Which is a problem even if you do not consume alcohol, as this mentality applies to everything else. Governments and powerful companies can always break the law without consequence, and because they have gone power-hungry over the past 2 years, that mentality stuck. And the place where the impact to citizenry is felt the hardest is on the grocery store shelves.
I picked a hell of a day to quit drinking.
Keeping with the theme of logistics, and again recognizing the vulnerabilities that have been strongly identified following the invasion of Ukraine, we find that even something as obscure as a postal system presents great vulnerabilities, if you rely on it for survival. If a shipping or logistics company decides they don't like you, you won't be able to mail anything. Looking just briefly into the future, it is not hard to imagine a day in which your address gets removed from the U.S. Postal Service listings because you didn't obey whatever dictatorial decree our politicians mandate next. And we're seeing that precedent being set right now with Russia.
But you remember this: when you control the mail, you control information.
In fact, we don't even have to look that far into the future, because we already have seen the revelation of a clandestine intelligence collection program within the United States Postal Service, literally called the Internet Covert Operations Program, in which the Postal Service spied on American social media posts. Specifically, they were spying on groups and activities that had absolutely nothing to do with their postal law enforcement jurisdiction, such as spying on social groups or political movements that they ideologically opposed. Oh, and instead of shutting down the program, they expanded it. So for those of you who have been concerned about intense government surveillance, you don't have to conjure up images of concrete buildings in Washington or secret data centers in the desert. Look no further than your neighborhood post office. Couple this with the decades-old process of the USPS scanning every single piece of mail and logging where it was sent to and who sent it. You now have every single tool you need to shut out certain groups of people from postal services. And if you, like most Americans, become increasingly reliant on ordering everything you need from Amazon, well, that presents a huge vulnerability if and when the day comes that logistical networks like the U.S. Postal Service become weaponized against the American people, like so many other agencies already have.
Just a sick world we're living in. Sick people.
A similar line of thought applies to public utilities. The past 2 years of medical tyranny have proven that things that used to take years and several court orders can now happen at the snap of a politician's fingers. It used to be super difficult to shut off someone's utilities, but now all a mayor has to do is call the utility company and they snap into action, without a single court order. We have talked about this so many times since these tactics started being used because it is such a massive problem. Water, sanitation, and energy to provide heating and cooling are 3 of the most important items necessary for sheer human survival. And the access to these things has already been weaponized against American citizens who dared to stand up to the government. So again, for everyone out there who is all about jumping on the anti-government bandwagon these days, just realize that your actions will result in consequences. Consequences like having your utilities shut off because you had too many people in your home and your neighbors turned you into the brown shirts. In an age where the US government has openly stated that their biggest enemies are the American people, one must be prepared to endure the consequences of standing up to these dictators. But if a person is self-reliant and can thrive under crackdown conditions, they will be a very incapable force. As one has probably noticed, a theme kind of emerges with a lot of these lessons learned, and we honestly have spent a lot of time trying to edit this down to where it doesn't seem like it's so anti-government, because I really don't like taking cheap shots at an entity like the US government, because it just seems like it's a lazy analytical effort, right? Everybody's all about, hating the government these days, and a lot of governmental groups make this very easy. And trust me, as you've probably noticed, there are kind of a lot of people out there that are anti-government these days. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just, if you're trying to maintain as neutral as possible and have kind of like an overall view of things, it's not really that productive to get sucked into a lot of these, rabbit holes sometimes. But here's the problem. At a certain point, even talking about the issues themselves is going to be perceived as anti-government. It's not even an opinion, it's just this historical event occurred. It's going to seem like you're trying to push some kind of anti-government message, which is not explicit, right? That's not the mood we're going for here. The mood we're going for here is lessons learned. But with this next lesson learned, we can't really get around that too much. And that lesson is the illegal intelligence collection on U.S. citizens. These days we are seeing illegal spying being openly conducted on American citizens on American soil with no concern whatsoever for any kind of national code or rule of law that prevents this. Executive Order 12333, Department of Defense Regulation 5240.1, Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, and the subsequent regulations of each individual military service branch all define intelligence collection on U.S. persons by active duty personnel. In short, there are a whole lot of rules as to what military service members can and cannot do when collecting information. But this is not the Snowden era of governments breaking every rule they can in private and pretending to care when someone exposes their secrets. No, they're doing it out in the open now. I never thought that I would see an EC-130 being used to collect intelligence on American soil, but here we are. One of the largest and most sophisticated intelligence collection and electronic warfare platforms the U.S. has circled over the trucker convoy. A little birdie, or rather a bat, did some sleuthing on this and put these slides together showing the extent of the intelligence collection, so thanks a lot, brother, for letting us use your slides. I know that a lot of you might not understand the significance of this, but this is a really big deal. This platform is a national level asset. This isn't a Black Hawk where the crew decides to get out of the office and do some training for a couple of hours. No, this kind of activity is tasked from the highest levels of government. And the correlation with the convoy's position and the timing confirms beyond reasonable doubt that intelligence was being collected on these truckers. In the intel world, it is way easier to submit a collection request for a freaking U-2 spy plane than it is to get an EC-130 Compass Call electronic warfare platform. As an intel guy, the only thing harder to get than that is a Global Hawk, but that's mostly because most of those are in the Pacific Theater anyway. We couldn't even allocate one to hunt for Hamza bin Laden in eastern Afghanistan, but here we are, burning racetracks in the sky over some truckers on American soil with one of the most sophisticated electronic warfare and intelligence collection platforms ever made. Maybe it's just that the team here has experience in the intel world and therefore is hypersensitive to these platforms because we know what they can do, but either way, the usage of a Compass Call platform on US soil is extremely, extremely concerning.
Boy, are you bugging me, man? I'm gonna nail. Ooh, I'm getting bugged now. Whoa, man.
And even though a lot of people have very little faith in Congress actually doing anything at all, for good reason, I guess, I think it would be very interesting to see what the House Armed Services Committee thinks about this, or the various intelligence oversight committees that are in Congress as well. It would be great for someone in the DoD to at least be held accountable for their actions at this stage, especially since those actions are now using active duty assets to spy on Americans on American soil. Again, in an age in which Americans are numb to their government spying on them, it would be wise to observe these tactics and start observing the ways to counter such spying. There will come a day when an incident, however minor, occurs in your local area, and a UAS or fixed-wing intelligence collection asset is dispatched to collect intelligence. Speaking as an intelligence professional, in previous years it was completely unheard of, or at least extremely, extremely rare for active duty military assets to collect intelligence on U.S. soil. There's just too much red tape. There's really nothing that can be done, and I know people probably aren't going to believe this, but the intel analysts out there know collecting intel on U.S. persons is a freaking nightmare. It's not something that's easily done, especially by a conventional asset. Of course it does get done occasionally, but over U.S. soil, not a chance, right? That's just not something that has happened with regards to active duty forces. Very much, right? You might have a case study here and there that I probably haven't even heard about, but for the most part, active duty soldiers are not conducting intelligence operations on U.S. soil. Of course, federal agencies, on the other hand, it's the complete opposite. Federal agencies have been spying on citizens since those agencies were created. But for the most part, active duty service members and military assets have had their hands tied and have not really collected intel on U.S. persons for very good reasons. But that is currently changing right now and has changed over the past couple of years. Like we keep mentioning, the U.S. will not be the same since the military occupation of Washington, D.C. early last year, and now we are finding out why. Of course, local law enforcement groups have been using quadcopters for a while, and there have been incidents in the past, but the civil unrest of the past few years has given us predator drones orbiting riots, or civilian versions of military Gorgon stare or whammy sensor packages being used in American cities. And that's bad enough as is, but we think that in the next few years, active duty soldiers using unmanned aerial systems to quote-unquote support civilian law enforcement activities will become commonplace. After all, our wars in the Middle East are winding down, and a lot of Raytheon board members, generals, will seek to find a new need for those shiny toys and the 20 years of doctrine in the making here at home. Again, some people in the dumpster fire of a comment section below will say that this is alarmist or overly dramatic or whatever, and that's fine. But these thoughts are not even speculative. They're not even really an assessment. It is literally just describing the history of what has already happened, and theorizing that what has already happened will probably expand and probably become more impactful to your daily life. And switching gears to the home front, we find a lot of new challenges as well, particularly when it comes to the education of children. To put it simply, if your child is not in the care of the state, they are much harder to brainwash. The past couple of years and the mass implementation of digital schooling methods have been very instrumental in this regard, enlightening a lot of parents as to what their kids were actually learning in school. There have been a lot of cases where parents are watching their kids in school sitting in front of a webcam and they are really surprised as to what their teachers are saying. This, again, has not really been a particularly new thing, but the parents that did pull their kids out of school to homeschool them found out just how easy it is, or how difficult it is if they were not dedicated to changing their lifestyle to raise and educate their own child. Responsibility is a challenge, and nothing requires personal responsibility more than raising a kid. Of course, not everyone can homeschool their kids these days. A lot of times, both parents have to work full-time jobs plus overtime just to make ends meet. And that is tough. But as we all know, the past couple of years have shown the disturbing things children are being taught in public and private schools. And speaking out against these horrific things gets you labeled as a terrorist by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. When federal agencies watch cities burn, but come down on you with the full force of the Patriot Act simply for questioning what your children are learning in school, perhaps that is an indicator of how important it is to get your children out of the control of the state, no matter how difficult that might be. In the medical world, just like everyone predicted, the medical tyranny that we have seen over the past couple of years is here to stay, and the precedents that were set during that hype are also long-lasting. For instance, remember how hospitals were denying medical treatment to those who were unjabbed? Well, guess what Germany is doing? They are now denying medical treatment to Russian citizens who are located in Germany for purely political reasons. And yes, the morbid irony of Germany doing this is quite thick. So in the past 365 days, we have gone from literally hundreds of years of medical decency, medical providers going all the way back to Hippocrates himself, treating even their wounded enemies on the battlefield, to denying medical treatment to citizens for political reasons. Now, some of you might balk at this and say that there was only one private clinic in Germany that adopted this policy. But that's literally how every bit of this medical tyranny has started. Here in the U.S., it was one small clinic at first, then another, and by the time a couple of weeks had elapsed, people are getting dropped from transplant lists. Switching gears a bit, we have to quickly talk about disarmament. And this is a quick one, because even though it has been one of the most severely important facets of life, disarmament is something that we have been dealing with decades before even I was born. So we do not need to harp on this one too much. The writing is already on the wall. Every day we find out some kind of illegal action the government is doing to disarm its own citizens, so it's not a really surprising thing at this point.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much.
But it is important to observe the tactics that are being used here at home. The same exact people who have been calling for gun control here at home are suddenly all about citizens getting fully automatic small arms in Ukraine. This Ukraine war has proven beyond all doubt the importance of a heavily armed civilian populace. And this is something that smaller European nations are observing right now. And I would guarantee that some of the smaller former Soviet republics will certainly be seriously re-examining their gun laws over the coming months due to how things have worked out in Ukraine. The same will not happen here in the US. In fact, our politicians, Democrats and Republicans alike, have reached across the aisle to come together and sneak US domestic gun control laws into the exact same bill that was supposed to be helping Ukraine fight off a foreign invader.
It's not a bribe.
Of course it's a bribe. You're offering to pay us money to not do our job.
Not a bribe.
Everyone knows why the U.S. has adopted this policy, regardless of political party. Nothing has united Democrats and Republicans more over the years than coming together to implement gun control. And the reason is simple. They realize that the government of the U.S. looks an awful lot like Russia. And the implications of this double standard are quite palpable at this stage, even to the average American. U.S. laws regarding firearms, while usually the most ambiguous laws on the book, are also the most severely enforced, solely for political reasons. Certain people are being arrested and put through a show trial, and other people are arrested in the same area for the same alleged offense and are out on bail within a few hours. This is not just a temporary failure of our justice system, it is becoming a cultural norm. And this is not just an echo of complaints about our justice system. People have been complaining about our justice system for a very long time.
First time?
But this is a very important distinction to remember. We do not live in the same world that we were born into, and the institutions that we learned about in grade school are merely shells of their former selves, which directly leads to our final observation. The recent news that the U.S. government has released the 20th 9/11 hijacker from prison has highlighted that there will be no quarter given to those who oppose, even at the smallest level, the actions of the state. Remember, as many people have pointed out, governments maintain the monopoly on violence, which is why 9/11 hijackers get released, but political prisoners are incarcerated for months without being charged with a crime. Whether or not you want to realize it, your government has designated you, the American people, as their biggest enemy. Even if that is not the case, there are certainly bigger fish to fry in the international arena. But in any case, I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. government's policy is to hurt its own citizens more than any other group on Earth. A lot of people try to bring politics into this, or try to lean on a particular political ideology for solutions to this. Heck, even pointing out this issue is political. Even we here have had great difficulty in trying to use as neutral language as possible when writing this, because sometimes even acknowledging a problem is viewed as political bias. But taking a fresh look at what's going on, and taking political ideology out of it as much as you can, we can see that we are living in an age where looking to a government to defend your rights is not the best move. And as such, do not be surprised if your rights are not honored. And we're not even talking about constitutional rights, we're talking about Geneva Convention's rights. Things are not going to get nasty, they already are nasty, and when it comes to the concept of human rights, looking to your government or a piece of paper to grant you those rights doesn't do too much good at the end of the day. So like we've mentioned before, there are consequences for that. Consequences do not care what you think about the situation, they do not care about your political views or how smart you are. Consequences will result from certain actions. Cause and effect. And if we cannot affect the cause, we must expect the effect. And the actions or inactions of prior generations is now being brought to bear. That's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. The thing to take away from this is that there are consequences for making it through these tough times. If you want to take a more active role in helping citizens, the consequences for that will result in lifestyle changes. Treating patients when the government has taken your medical license for political reasons has consequences. Teaching citizens forbidden knowledge has consequences. And even taking your own children out of school to homeschool them has consequences. All of these will result in a person might not having the social life or comfortable lifestyle that they are used to. But if a person is more prepared and is willing or even capable of accepting these consequences, then the power disparity between the citizenry and the dictators over them will be sharply reduced.
Why is it us? Why us?
Because we're here, lad. Nobody else.
All of these observations paint a fairly bleak picture for the future if you let them. These observations are not meant to stoke fear or encourage hatred, but rather to encourage people to help us find solutions to these issues. In due time, we will provide our ideas on how to tackle some of these problems, as we have been doing for years. And spoiler alert, we don't have any particularly groundbreaking ideas. The themes over the past few years have remained a constant, more or less. Although, with an apparently rapidly declining civilization, the need for more succinct solutions quickly has become more urgent. So as we continue to work on the solutions for these issues, from the technical side of things to the more societal and everything in between, let's start thinking about ways to reduce our own personal vulnerabilities in our own lives. You cannot help anyone if you are just as vulnerable as they are. Right now, we are again in a time for choosing. A time for choosing what path we want to take, what course of history we want to follow. And more importantly, a time for choosing how to feel about the whole situation. We can choose to be downtrodden, woefully heading into yet another global or even civil conflict. We can let the world's problems overwhelm us to the point that we don't even want to get out of bed. Or we can take the initiative. In the early days of both world wars, people were scared too, just like we all are right now. As nations mobilized for global war, there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear. But there was also a bit of excitement. I don't know about anyone else, but I myself am choosing to be excited. Not excited for a global conflict or any kind of death and destruction that comes with it, but excited that we have the opportunity to choose the path of history that we sometimes over-romanticize. Right now, we, the common people, have a chance to truly change not just our world, but the world for generations to come. It is what we do right now that defines the future. Right now, there are no trivial actions. Everything that you choose to do to either better your world or detract from it will have lasting impacts for centuries to come. Right now, the world is looking to us to get this right. The entirety of humanity has placed a large burden on our shoulders. A heavy burden to be sure, but we are fortunate that the burden of fixing the world's problems falls to us, the average American. And this burden cannot be easily solved by generations of war or oppression, nor can it be solved by animosity, anger, or apathy. A burden that we can only carry by working together. And we have our work cut out for us. We have to do everything from inventing new technologies to revitalizing old ones. We have to come up with feasible solutions to these problems and stay sane while doing it. But we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Nothing good or worthwhile ever comes easy, and history does not often look kindly on those who chose the easy path when it was offered to them. Fortunately, there are no easy paths any longer, and those that have chosen the easy, comfortable lifestyles in the past will have to adapt. The challenges of the future already demand us to dedicate our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And if we can meet these challenges head on, and do our utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on we alone, then we might be worthy of being named the last best hope for mankind. So let us not become the downtrodden, looking woefully into the dark future ahead. Let us instead be grateful that the task of making our future bright falls to us, the people. And if we are successful, the generations that follow us will look back and see that it was not a tyrant or an oppressor that changed the course of human events, but average Americans. So let's get after it and let us take things one day at a time. Improving ourselves and striving to be a better person every day will make a difference. I know it will. So that's all we have for now, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.